Something has shifted in Africa, and most people didn't even notice. Money started moving in the opposite direction. Not because Africa collapsed, not because there was a war, not because a financial crisis exploded on your television screen. No, something far more dangerous happened. For the first time in years, more money began leaving Africa than entering it, and that made people uncomfortable. You see, the global system is used to one story about Africa, one script, one predictable cycle. Money goes in, aid flows, loans arrive, experts speak, reports are written, and Africa is described as developing. But what happens when the money stops coming in and starts going out? Suddenly the headlines get nervous, analysts lower their voices, words like risk and exposure and instability begin floating around. But here's the strange part. Nothing collapsed. Currencies didn't crash overnight. Governments didn't shut down. Ports didn't stop operating. Lights didn't go out. So why the panic? Listen carefully, because this isn't about failure, it's about phase change. To understand what's happening, you have to go back to when the flood began. When China entered Africa at full force under the banner of the Belt and Road Initiative, launched by Xi Jinping. People said it was generosity. Some said it was strategy. Others said it was a trap. But here's what most people miss. China did not wake up one morning and decide to help Africa. China had a vulnerability. Its factories were expanding faster than its trade routes. Its energy lifelines passed through choke points it did not control. Its raw materials came from thousands of miles away, across waters influenced by rival powers. That's not charity territory. That's survival territory. Africa wasn't a side project. It was a geographic solution. So when China arrived, it didn't bring speeches. It brought engineers. It brought cranes, it brought rail lines, it brought ports that could load faster, power plants that could generate independently, fibre cables that bypassed Western digital control points. And Africa accepted. Why? Because the alternative had been slow promises. Western financing talked about development, but avoided hard infrastructure unless it came with endless studies, privatization conditions, or political strings that stretched longer than the projects themselves. China offered speed. But here is the part nobody prepared the public for. Those loans were never meant to last forever. Every infrastructure project has a life cycle. Construction, operation, revenue, repayment. The inflow phase, the part where billions arrive and cranes fill the skyline. That phase always ends. And when it ends, something uncomfortable begins. Repayment. You see, when a port starts collecting fees, when a railway starts moving freight daily, when a power plant starts selling electricity, the logic flips. Money doesn't need to keep coming in, it starts moving internally. And eventually, outward. That's the moment we are in right now. And the world doesn't quite know how to react. Because Africa is rarely allowed to finish things. Africa is usually kept in permanent construction mode, permanent need, permanent inflow, permanent dependency. But what happens when infrastructure is no longer a promise, but an asset? That's when leverage starts to change. And leverage is power. So when the numbers showed that Africa had shifted from receiving net inflows from China to sending net outflows, roughly a $52 billion swing, the language changed instantly. Risk, exposure, debt stress. But pause, that number doesn't represent collapse. It represents maturity. Grace periods expired, contracts activated. Repayment schedules began exactly as designed. This is not a crisis event. It's a post-construction event, and that difference matters more than people realize. Because once Africa begins servicing its own built assets, the question changes from who will fund Africa to something far more dangerous for the global financial system. What happens when Africa doesn't need to be rescued? Think about that. If Africa's infrastructure begins funding itself, if governments are no longer structurally desperate for constant inflows, if leverage weakens, then someone somewhere loses influence. And influence is never surrendered quietly. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Because when the inflow phase ended, China didn't rush back with bigger loans, it slowed down. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deliberately. And when a major lender slows down after building assets, that's not retreat, that's a test. The construction phase is over. Now performance begins. And performance is unforgiving. Now here is where the tension deepens. Because the moment Africa stopped absorbing endless inflows, a vacuum opened, and in global finance vacuums never stay empty. As Chinese lending slowed, something very strategic happened. Multilateral institutions quietly increased their presence. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, regional development banks. Over the past decade, their net financing surged dramatically. Once repayments were accounted for, they became the dominant source of development funding. Now pause, this was not random. Influence follows dependency. Infrastructure loans build assets and then step back. But budget financing, that stays close. Year after year, quarter after quarter. And budget financing doesn't ask, will this port be completed? It asks something far more sensitive. Can salaries be paid next month? Can fuel subsidies continue? Can social programs survive the next fiscal quarter? That is a different kind of leverage. China's model built physical assets, ports, railways, grids, and expected them to generate revenue. Multilateral institutions moved into fiscal space, stability space, social spending space. This wasn't a replacement, it was a battlefield shift. But here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. The safety net this time was thinner. Western governments were facing their own economic strain. Political polarization was rising. Foreign aid tolerance was shrinking quietly, almost invisibly. Budgets were being trimmed. Development agencies were being scaled down. The message wasn't dramatic, it was indifferent. Priorities had moved. So now imagine the overlap. China slows sovereign lending, expecting performance. Multilateral institutions increase financing, but with tighter conditions and shorter patience. Meanwhile, unconditional aid, the quiet cushion that used to soften shocks, begins to recede. Do you see the corridor forming? Africa is no longer in permanent construction mode, but it is not fully insulated either. And when buffers thin, exposure accelerates. For decades, many African governments operated inside a protected contradiction, unfinished enough to justify aid, functional enough to avoid collapse. That contradiction is dissolving. And when it dissolves, something very dangerous happens. Blame shifts inward. Listen carefully. When money flows endlessly from outside, citizens argue about donors, about colonialism, about global systems. But when external money shrinks, citizens look at their own leaders. Hospitals either function or they don't. Electricity grids either collect payments or they collapse. Rail networks either move goods profitably or they bleed. There is no geopolitical speech that can power a turbine. There is no ideological alignment that can replace maintenance budgets. Execution becomes visible, and visibility is political dynamite. That is why analysts started using the phrase net negative. Not because Africa suddenly became poorer overnight, but because delay became impossible. Inflow-heavy systems allow postponement. You can refinance, renegotiate, extend grace periods, shift blame. Exposure forces outcomes, and outcomes are ruthless. Now here is where observers miscalculated. Many assumed that because lending slowed, China was retreating. They were wrong. China did not exit Africa's economy, it moved deeper into it. Instead of broad sovereign loans, China began leaning into construction contracts, equity participation, and revenue-linked investments. Fewer blank checks, more asset-specific engagement. In 2025, China's overseas deal-making reached record levels, but the composition changed. Fewer open-ended government loans, more direct involvement tied to whether projects actually generate cash. That is not withdrawal, that is repositioning. And repositioning sends a message. The infrastructure phase is over. Now comes the performance phase. A port that collects fees does not care about speeches. A railway that moves freight does not respond to ideology. A power plant that sells electricity does not survive on political alignment. Cash flows or it doesn't. This is a colder relationship. And it forces something Africa has rarely been allowed to confront directly: structural responsibility. Because when loans were flowing heavily, failure could always be framed as still developing. Refinancing could soften mistakes. Delays could be absorbed. Now, performance is binary. Either revenue covers obligations or it doesn't. And when no one is carrying the system anymore, not China with easy refinancing, not donors with unconditional aid, something else becomes unavoidable: competence. Some governments will adjust quickly, some will struggle. Some will face political consequences they can no longer outsource to global narratives. And that is where the real sorting begins. Because this story was never just about money direction, it was about leverage. And when leverage weakens externally, pressure intensifies internally. So the real question now is not whether Africa can repay loans. The real question is this: which systems were built to perform? And which were built to depend? Now the pressure stops being theoretical. This is the phase nobody announces on television. No breaking news banner, no emergency summit, no dramatic default, just narrowing space. For a long time, African governments operated with at least one cushion underneath them. If infrastructure underperformed, renegotiate. If debt schedules tightened, refinance. If budgets ran thin, emergency support. There was always something external to lean on. That cushion is thinning. Not because Africa suddenly changed, because the world did. Western governments began cutting foreign aid quietly. Development budgets shrank. Political tolerance for overseas spending weakened. Domestic voters started asking harder questions. And when voters ask harder questions, foreign assistance becomes an easy target. No dramatic speech, just paperwork, just reduced allocations, just shorter commitments. The message wasn't hostile, it was indifferent. Now think about the timing. China had already slowed sovereign lending, expecting assets to perform. Multilateral institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank had stepped in, but with conditions, reviews, fiscal discipline requirements. And now the final cushion, softer aid, begins receding. This isn't collapse, this is exposure. And exposure accelerates reality. When cushions disappear, governments face immediate arithmetic. Public services must be funded internally. Infrastructure must generate cash flow. Subsidies must be justified by revenue. Political speeches cannot power grids. Rhetoric cannot service debt. Execution becomes visible in real time. And here's the uncomfortable truth. This phase is politically dangerous. When money flows from outside, citizens argue with donors, they debate global injustice. They talk about unfair trade systems, but when external flows shrink, citizens look inward. They look at procurement systems. They look at corruption. They look at tax collection. They look at how efficiently assets are managed. Excuses lose weight. Blame shifts. And political stability becomes directly tied to performance. That is why analysts describe the moment as net negative. But listen carefully. Net negative does not mean poorer. It means unprotected. There is a difference. For decades, Africa existed in a protected contradiction. Unfinished enough to justify aid, functional enough to survive. That contradiction is dissolving. And when it dissolves, sorting begins. Hospitals either function or they don't. Railways either move freight profitably or they bleed. Ports either collect fees efficiently or they become burdens. There is no middle narrative. Now here is where the story becomes even more strategic. While everyone focused on shrinking aid and tighter multilateral oversight, one assumption quietly broke apart. A Thico assumption that China would fade away. It didn't. China didn't disappear. It recalibrated. Instead of pushing more broad sovereign loans, China leaned into construction contracts, equity stakes, and revenue-linked investments. Less money handed to governments, more money tied directly to assets. This is subtle, but it is brutal. Loans absorb political failure. Assets expose it. When China was lending heavily under the Belt and Road Initiative, refinancing was an option. Delays could be tolerated. Underperformance could be renegotiated. Now, revenue-linked projects do not negotiate with speeches. Either a port generates fees or it doesn't. Either electricity bills are collected or they are not. Cash flow is binary. This repositioning means China no longer needs to argue politically. It only needs to watch numbers. If assets perform, China benefits. If they fail, the problem is not geopolitical. It is operational. That is a colder relationship. And it sends a message beyond China. Africa is no longer being treated as permanently fragile. It is being treated as structurally responsible. And that is where the corridor tightens. Because now you have three simultaneous pressures. Chinese financing expecting performance, multilateral financing demanding discipline, shrinking aid removing cushions. No one is carrying the system anymore. And when no one is carrying you, two things happen. Weak systems crack, strong systems stabilize. This is not dramatic, it is surgical. Sorting does not make noise, it reveals capacity. And this is why the moment feels tense but strangely quiet. There is no singular crisis to point at, just a shift from survival funding to performance economics. And that shift changes everything. Because once results become measurable, influence becomes harder to maintain. So here is the real tension building under the surface. If Africa is no longer being managed through permanent inflows, if assets must now justify themselves, if leaders can no longer hide behind global narratives, then who is actually ready for this phase? Not rhetorically, operationally. That question is no longer theoretical. It is already being answered. Now we arrive at the part nobody can avoid. This is not about China anymore. It's not about the International Monetary Fund. It's not about the World Bank. It's not even about the Belt and Road Initiative. It's about performance. Because when survival funding fades, performance becomes the only language left. And performance is merciless. For decades, failure in Africa could be externalized. If infrastructure stalled, donor fatigue. If budgets collapsed, unfair global systems. If debt rose, exploitative lending structures. Some of those arguments were valid, but they also delayed something critical: internal reckoning. Now that delay is gone, infrastructure exists, ports are standing, rail lines are laid, power plants are built, fibre networks are installed. The cranes have left. Now the numbers speak, and numbers don't negotiate. This is the phase Africa has rarely been allowed to enter fully. The phase where systems must justify themselves without emotional cushioning. No one is coming with emergency construction money. No one is offering endless refinancing cycles. No one is pretending performance can be postponed indefinitely. This is the sorting phase. Listen carefully. When results become visible, politics transforms. Power no longer comes from who you align with externally. It comes from whether your systems function internally. Tax collection efficiency suddenly matters more than foreign speeches. Maintenance budgets matter more than geopolitical positioning. Revenue tracking matters more than conference appearances. And this is where the discomfort intensifies. Because a results-driven Africa is harder to influence. You cannot pressure a country through aid cuts if it does not rely on aid. You cannot dictate terms through refinancing if projects are self-financing. You cannot manipulate narratives when citizens can measure performance themselves. Exposure creates clarity, and clarity creates accountability. That is why this shift is being framed as net negative. Because exposure feels dangerous, especially to systems that thrived in opacity. But exposure is not collapse. Exposure is transition. Some governments will adapt. They will strengthen tax systems, improve asset management, professionalize infrastructure operations, prioritize maintenance over ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Those systems will stabilize. Others will struggle. They will face revenue shortfalls, operational inefficiencies, political backlash, public frustration. And this time they cannot outsource the explanation. This phase doesn't reward ideology. It doesn't reward rhetoric. It rewards competence. And competence is measurable. This is why the moment feels tense but quiet. There is no single breaking point, no dramatic implosion, just a narrowing corridor where excuses disappear and arithmetic takes over. Africa is crossing a line most regions cross quietly, the line between being funded to survive and being expected to perform. That line is uncomfortable. It is uneven. It will not be smooth, but it is also powerful. Because once systems learn to operate without permanent external cushioning, leverage shifts permanently. And when leverage shifts, so does influence. So the real question is no longer, is Africa in crisis? The real question is far sharper. Which governments built systems that can function without constant inflows? Which leaders prepared for asset maturity instead of permanent borrowing? Which institutions strengthened internal capacity instead of external dependency? Because in this new phase, the scoreboard is visible. Revenue either covers costs, assets either generate cash flow, public services either operate sustainably, or they don't. And when results become the only currency left, only the prepared remain standing. Now, the story is no longer about money moving in or out. It's about whether Africa is ready for a performance era. And that answer will not come from Beijing. It will not come from Washington. It will not come from Brussels. It will come from inside the continent itself. The sorting has already begun. The question is, who survives it?